Hello, everyone, and welcome to the culminating conversation as it regards Lila by Marilynne Robinson. This is a gathering of the Ridiculously Goodreads book group from First Presbyterian Church in Hastings, Nebraska. I am Damon. I am one of the pastors there. And we have spent the last 6 weeks-ish reading through Lila. Written by Marilynne Robinson. I had a copy of the book somewhere, and then I lost it. This right here, this is my copy. I have the Oprah's Book Club edition, which doesn't mean anything at all. But so we are up to the end of the book, or at least I am up to the end of the book. I don't really have a really good way of starting our discussion other than just to open it. Anything from the last section of the book that really stuck out to folks that you wanted to caught your attention or that you've been pondering for a little while?
Well, I think the birth story is one that we have to talk about. I mean, it takes up a lot of the last section of the book, the labor, the fear of the snowstorm and Lila going into labor, what's happening, is she in denial, what happens with the birth, all of that. Like, I love a good birth story, and this one's intense. But I think, we've been probably for most of the book waiting for this part to happen, right? We know there's a child. That's very well established with the other books, but it seems like that was the whole purpose of this book, was to get us to how, or the story behind the child.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that birth narrative also features a botched baptism, an incomplete baptism, Ames has gotten some snow and melted it in the sunlight, and Boughton has come, the other old man, who seems much older than Ames, at least by the way Lila describes him. He's holding the bowl with his weak hand, but then just spills a whole bunch of the water on to the baby, and is upset with himself about it. It seems. So another just kind of, I don't know, I guess that all just adds kind of to the mystery of baptism. And does it depend on the proper words being said in the proper way at the proper time, or does it have to do with the intention? And Boughton says, well, if we didn't act on our intention when we had the opportunity, then one might question the seriousness of our intention, which is interesting. Other things from the birth narrative that stood out for people?
Well, it seemed to me that there was some doubt about how well the child would fare, whether the child would actually live, which is, of course, a fear that, Boughton has lost his first child with his first wife. Lila had wanted to steal a baby in St. Louis, and that was a lost opportunity. There's all that Ezekiel stuff about the child, weltering in its blood in a field cast aside. And God comes along and saves the child. But 2 weeks later, they do take it to the church, and Ames himself does baptize the child and also rebaptizes Lila without having asked her.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And it seems to me one of the most crucial lines happens right there, because we couldn't stand not to have you with us. We couldn't bear it. So he and the baby want her in their afterlife. Am I reading that wrong, Damon?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, he wants to make sure, it seems. He's he 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 trusts, it seems, in the gracious mercy of God, perhaps leans into that perhaps more so than Boughton does. And also, yeah, he wants to make sure.
Which is interesting because, we already had a scene where he baptized her, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Halfway through the book. So
But then she unbaptizes herself, or at least tries to.
she tries to, right? She tries to, and she kind of wants to, but doesn't Ames as much tell her that you can't
Wash
wash it off? So I guess I found myself confused as to why he felt the need to do it again. So is that what you're saying, Damon? Like, it's sort of this question of what's really authoritative, or what?
I think that's part of it. I think it might also in part, maybe Ames thinks that this is going to reassure her in some way. And I think also it's interesting in this section, there were parts where Lila would say or think something that was like, up until that point, that was something that Ames said. Like at one point, Lila says, I'll have to think about that, which is an Ames thing to say, right? And so Lila, to me, seems to be sort of taking up the questions that Ames has been living with. And I think part of the rebaptism, I think in Ames is also just like, he has a genuine appreciation, I think, for the mystery of God. And for not knowing, and isn't really certain about anything. And so what's the harm, I guess, in rebaptizing her? And it's also just this sort of lovely, just this expression of love as well.
Yeah, I've got the line here, but I wanted you to know that we couldn't bear. We have to keep you with us. Please, God. It's
Yeah.
one of the
So
most heartfelt things he's ever said to me.
Yeah. So it's that's as much for her as, it's as much a moment of him telling her that he loved her as it is anything else, I think. We also get in this section more of Lila's. We kind of get a sense of where Lila has ultimately landed on her question of existence, both here and in the hereafter, I think, right? And she seems to kind of have ultimately sort of come down in line with Ames. I think this is where Ames would be, just in the sense that she can't imagine that Doan and the others wouldn't be bound up with her in heaven, if for no other reason than it's not fair for them to not be. And also she can't bear to not be with them.
And that seems to be everybody's admission ticket to life everlasting, is if somebody has cared about them and couldn't bear to leave them behind. Because we've got, the boy, the dirty boy in the shack. We've got Mac, we've got Mac's baby, we've got all of China that Bowden lifts up, and we've got oh yeah, the boy in the shack's father that was killed or may have been killed.
Yeah. Yeah, I've forgotten about that. hmm It's in some ways it kind of reminds me of so if I'm remembering correctly, Ames's grandfather, we think, ran around with John Brown,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, John Brown, and sort of had this, I suppose, fundamental belief in equality, right? That slavery was an immoral institution and should be abolished at all costs, right? And that's, which is like this sort of belief in like a universal equality, and this belief is similar to that in some ways. That surely the gracious mercy of God is for everyone. If it's for anybody, then it must be for everybody, regardless of whether or not they had anyone to tell them about it or love them or whatever the case might be.
Which makes the double baptism, just in case, really extra interesting then.
What do you mean by that, Jenny?
Well, if Lila has landed on this side of, well, Doan and Doll are going to be with her in the afterlife because surely they must be, and you're saying that Ames, that's also the same side he would be on because of like his ancestry lineage and beliefs in their family. But then also Ames is the one who double baptizes her just to make sure that she gets in. It's a weird, it's like a both.
Well, and Ames always says, or at least once says to Lila, I'm going to keep you safe and you're going to keep me honest. And I think her very raw questions cause him to rethink a lot of things and think, not just about pat doctrinal answers, but
so that's another thing that I noticed when reading this last section was, and maybe it popped up earlier in the book too, but they're having, I don't know if it was when he's talking about the sermon or something, but she's asking him about prayer and worry and like what's the difference between praying and worrying. Do you remember that line? I don't guess I can't remember the context now of that, but it seems like another, like one of those bigger questions that she has of like, well, what's so different of those two things?
Yeah, and I think they kind of said, well, yeah, they're kind of the same thing to some extent. There's also like, and so in these last two sections of it, it seems we really see we see more and more of what draws, I think, Ames and Lila towards one another. And we see more and more of them, I think, becoming one in some ways. And they both acknowledge that in conversation at some point. They both talk about how like they've both experienced suffering and loneliness and longing, and that they've both sort of borne witness to tragedy in some way, and we start to see them sort of, I think, growing alike in thought as well. And that to me, Jenny, was another kind of one of those moments of, oh, we're kind of doing the same thing, just from maybe the other side of the coin.
Well, it seems to me like she's maybe asking him for a definition of prayer there too, because then there's several comments that he makes about what prayer is. And he essentially, I think it boils down to, he says like, well, everything I think and is a prayer.
Yeah.
And then later she's referring to herself as the wife is prayer and something else is prayer. I don't know. There's just this
Yeah.
kind of lingering question, definition, wondering that's happening between the two of them.
Yeah, I think he says a marriage is prayer
Prayer.
as
Family
well.
is prayer.
Mhm.
I think one of the things that really caught my attention was Lila finally coming to be able to articulate how much of human knowledge or her awareness is really based on fragments and shards of what we don't know. On page 223, she's talking about, and that's I think this is pretty heavy stuff. She said our experience is fragmentary; its parts don't add up, and she is, I think, maybe much more than John Ames, um, impressed with the natural world and all the forces of the natural world which cannot be explained. I just thought the last 50 pages were, some kind of a culmination of, Marilynne Robinson's kind of building that steam up to really come to some kind of closure. Experience does not accumulate like money or memory or like years.
Yeah, but this part is actually, this is Ames has woken up in the night with some sort of thought and scribbled it down on a piece of paper. And I think that this is part of that. This is part of Ames' reflection.
Okay.
But then Lila responds to it. I mean, so yeah, Ames is reading to her. And Constance, I remember you mentioning maybe like last week about Lila's sharp perception, her ability just to like zero in on people and situations and things like that. And so Ames is reading this rough draft basically, and she says, "You've been worrying about Mrs. Ames." Like she knows right away that he's trying to reconcile in his own mind the love that he had for his first wife and child, and then his current wife and soon to be child kind of thing. But Denny, what you said about like nature and Lila, I noticed several instances in this last section again where Lila's wild heart, she's talking about her wild, that phrase comes up at least twice, if not more, when she's talking about her wild heart in relationship to the baby and the baby like feeling and knowing her wild heart and stuff. And I think that really speaks to that idea of like Lila has always known and been more comfortable just like out in the wild and in nature and wandering. And so this is such a change for her to stay somewhere.
Well, she's had to, as a wanderer, accommodate herself to the wild forces and unpredictable forces of nature just to survive. It just seems natural, normal. And Jenny, I think you're absolutely right that, this is a little strange, being in a one place in a comfortable home with a kitchen and ham and eggs and like, whoa.
I think one of the things in the first part of this section that I noticed was, and this has been throughout the book, but the garden. There's a lot of mention of the garden in like the 220s. And I remember I wrote in my notes in the margins, I said, it's anchoring, those gardens are anchoring her in Gilead because she wants to, more than the people, she can't handle the people, but she wants to see how those gardens are growing. How's that garden coming along? Because she's just, that's what's comfortable for her is to pay attention to the plants. And then like, oh, the people, little less so here at first. and maybe always, I guess, I don't know.
I think she begins to overcome that a little bit, though,
Yeah.
because she notices a difference in herself in that you know, the way that she was brought up, you don't deal with strangers, you don't talk to strangers, you don't trust strangers. But that's a lot more tempered in her now. She sees herself as, you know, in fact, even with Ames, she notices that he's, you know, she's starting to trust him, but then she kind of draws herself back and hurts him, says something that hurts him. And she says, you know, I used to say something mean like that just because, you know, I was afraid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to kind of keep him at a little bit of a distance.
Right.
Yeah. But then she ends up in a room with a lot of strangers looking at her when she is very vulnerable while she's giving birth and immediately afterwards. And then two of them give her a bath.
Right. That struck me as really odd that she would be nursing her baby in front of all the Bowtons, father and son, and so forth.
But Constance, how was it done when she was outside? To paraphrase John le Carré, you know, out in the cold, when the cold represented, you know, the wilderness, the wilds of natural forces. Babies probably were nursed that way, I would think, because there's no privacy.
Right. I'm thinking back to the woman that they encountered. She and Melly and Doll encountered the woman that was having a stillborn child. It was a premature child. And they all washed her and helped deliver the baby and all that kind of stuff. And I think swaddled the child, but they were all women too.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of callbacks in this section, as there are in all the sections. It reminded me of the bath that the first bath that we see Lila getting in the story, and how she really objected to it, and this bath now she finds to be calming. I think. And we also get in this section this, I don't know, maybe we had heard about it before, I didn't really remember. Ames's coat that he would put over her while they walked. And she says it reminds her of the shawl that Doll would put over her, and which I thought was just a lovely little passage.
And does she have her own shawl when they go to the church to baptize the baby?
Yes, because the baby is wrapped with her in the shawl.
Yeah, there's a lot of the wrapping imagery happening.
Yes.
And the significance of that.
Yeah, there's one thing that I thought, thinking, Denny, of that passage about the fragmentary nature of our experience or our existence. I was reading that and I thought, oh, that's what all these books are. All of these books are just little fragments of things stitched and patched together into something. Okay, if that's how the author understands our existence, then it makes sense that the writing it comes out this way.
Well, there seems to be, to me, through all these books that we have read from Gilead to Lila, somewhat of an acceptance of whoever that was that walked into town. For the minister to marry this gal who walked in because she wanted to get out of the rain, and they knew nothing else about that person, but yet it was okay for their minister to marry her. An acceptance of really the unknown to a great extent. And that seems to me that recurs throughout all the books that we've read. An underlying acceptance, if you will. That's
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, certainly Lila herself lives that out. She accepts that young man who shows up at the shack. She really accepts and is compassionate to the other women in St. Louis. It seems to me. Yeah.
Well, and even if you look back at home, Glory is accepted back home, after her situation. And Jack is welcomed back time and time again, even though he's Jack. So there's that. I did notice at the very, very end of this, what seems like the conversation that plants the seed for what becomes Gilead, where Lila, did you see that? Did you notice that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Page, it's really close to the end.
He's taken the child fishing, I think.
Yes.
Where is it? Well, I thought I wrote it. Ugh, now I'm throwing my book down. Page 252, Lila tells Ames to write things down. And isn't that what Gilead is Ames writing the letter to his son, writing the letter of his life and story. I'm like, oh, Lila told you to do that. Okay. And maybe we knew that in the first book and I've forgotten, but.
I don't think we did.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he took the child fishing. He came back an hour later and set the empty creel on the table and said, "We propped the pole and watched dragonflies. Then we got a little tired." And at this, I stumbled over this next sentence for quite some time. "And what a look he gave her in the sorrow of his happiness."
Mm-hmm.
He might as well have said, "When he is old enough to understand, tell him about the day we went fishing." So she said, "You might as well be writing things down."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I found really striking this. Both of these characters, Lila and Ames, have a certain sort of melancholy about themselves that comes through, and it seems to really come through for Ames in this section. It seems to me, but I was struck. There's a passage where Lila imagines. She's imagining the resurrection. And she imagines Ames. She knows what's coming next. And that is that Ames will die and she and their son will watch him get lowered into the ground. And then they'll have to move on. And then she imagines the whole Ames family being resurrected, and then they come up out of their graves in June, I think, and manage not to bother the roses somehow, and greet one another in this kind of lovely way.
Isn't it called a garden of Ames's?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she seems to not. Lila seems to not really know if she fits into that garden or not.
Right.
She doesn't imagine herself being buried there.
No, there's no room left for
No,
her that White imagines. And she may have to take him back to her old life. But it would be the old.
She makes a promise. I think this is even before the baby is born. She makes a promise to the child that he will know. So even if Ames weren't to write it down, he will know who his father was. She will tell him his name. That's very important to her because it's something she didn't have. So I think for as much as she longs for her old life sometimes and would potentially be willing to go back to it, I think she would still do things differently than Doll did, because she wants her child to know. You know, she wanted to know, so she wants to be able to give that to her son.
Right. And the child will pray before each meal and know the Bible, etc.
Yeah, he'll know all the hymns.
And the hymns, yes.
Yep. No old 100th.
On page 225, Lila is thinking about, I've been tramping around with the heathens. They're just as good as anybody. So far as I can see, they don't deserve no hellfire. And it seems to me that Lila, unlike the people of Gilead, has experienced the wild, has come in from the wild, and sees the whole other side of appropriate behavior and appropriate thought. And I'm reminded of a Mark Twain quote that popped up in the Ken Burns Mark Twain documentary that he did, which I recommend to any of you if you haven't seen it. Something to the effect, isn't it marvelous that all those millions and millions of people, happy people, have existed their whole lives without knowing anything about hell? And it's kind of that blissful ignorance of, if you will, of being outside the institutional Christian experience as it was defined in Gilead. Anyway,
Yeah.
it's almost Mari Sendak, where the wild things are. It's a
Yeah, well, I think at one point she said, the child will be raised so that the question of whether or not he'll never really even consider whether or not he's he's accepted into heaven, because it'll just sort of be a part of what he'll always know. Another thought that I had about this is going way back to when we were talking about prayer, and prayer and worry, and are they the same thing? And family is a prayer, and marriage is a prayer, and whatever else is a prayer. I forget what he said. Wife. Thank you. If you, another, like a really simple way of thinking of, not necessarily simple, but a short way of thinking about prayer is an attempt to connect with something beyond ourselves. So most of the time that's God, but if you think of, if it's simply an attempt to connect with something beyond myself, then yeah, family is prayer, and marriage is prayer, and all the things that we attempt to connect ourselves to that we know are bigger than us, I guess, in some way, then yeah, all those things are prayer. So
but the connection is ultimately what's important. I think we
Yeah.
touched on that a little bit last time. I was just kind of looking back over all the notes from the beginning of the novel to the end, and Lila is mute as a child. She only says two things when she's first picked up by Doll and taken to the house of the woman that Doll knows. And those two things are objections to being cared for. And in both of those, she says, and these are the only things she says as a young person, are two things about hell. I hope you have a broken back in hell, and something else about hell.
Mm-hmm.
She's wishing these women in hell. And that's so not her thought toward the end of the novel.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everything's about resurrection in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think when she's picturing the Garden of Ames's rising up, she kind of, I think, then kind of says to herself, well, that it could be 1,000 years from now. And right now, what's in front of me is a child, and so there's this kind of, which I think is reflective of that. It's a mystery. Who knows what'll happen? So I guess let's just live today.
And that seems kind of an ultimate message. Basically, there are things that we can't penetrate, so why spend the time fretting about them?
Mm-hmm.
And everything boils down to God's grace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we get a few more allusions in this section to, he doesn't get named, but yeah. All the Boughtons will come running except one.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And Boughton says something about all my children were born big and strong, except the one, but he grew up to be tall and exceptionally handsome or something. So you never know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
246 and 247, except the one, and the other one.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not going to be named, but he's very present in absentia.
Right. And we get our first instance of Lila relating to Jack here in that paragraph, where she's not saying it out loud, but it's written here. What did he do to make them all turn against him? Well, the old man had said it was really more the other way around. She didn't tell him she sort of understood how that could happen. And I seem to remember that, like, Lila and Jack is an area of contention for Ames, and I think he can see Lila and Jack maybe ending up together when he's gone, sort of. I don't know if that's his internal fear there, but
Yeah.
But here we already, she's never even laid eyes on Jack yet, but he's mentioned just enough, and she sees something similar in their experiences or in their lives, or something that we're getting a glimpse of even here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it says a couple of these. He always has half of a thought that somebody's going to show up looking for her to take her, not to take her away, but some man will show up, surely at some point, looking for her, and maybe it's Jack.
Could be.
Well, not Jack, then Mac, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would be Be surprised if Mac was Mac's real name.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it seems to be in the last 50 pages, you really see Lila's profound understanding of the forces of nature, which in my read is the forces of God, manifested in prairie wind.
Yeah.
A beautiful description of the prairie wind and the snowstorm as forces that almost defy explanation. And you really can't do much about them, if anything, except, adapt yourself. And I think maybe she's more aware of that than the people of Gilead, because she's had to deal with it out there in the raw.
Yeah, there's on page 260 and 261, this connects really well, Denny, to what you were talking about. This is right at the end. That's how it is. Lila had born a child into a world where wind could rise that would take him from her arms, as if there were no strength in them at all. Pity us, yes, but we are brave, she thought, and wild, more life in us than we can bear, the fire enfolding itself in us. That peace could only be amazement too. That sort of sense of anything can happen. All of this can go away at any moment. All of it can show up at any moment as well.
There seems to be the impression in her mind, the thought in her mind that, we must look to the future, because looking to the past is basically useless. It's, what you're going to do the next day and where the next meal is coming from. And
yeah, well, I think that seems, if that's the case, that seems to be something then that she has kind of worked through. She and Ames have conversations about, like, does your past determine your present, or does your past determine your future? And I guess in part no, it's just fragmentary stuff that happens.
Yeah, I think she had learned from Dahl that what you've been determines what you will become. And she leaves that off in this section. She realizes that you're not the sum of all the bad things you've ever done, and you're not the sum of all the best things you've ever done, but that grace falls over it all. There must be a line like that.
Yeah, there is someplace.
Yeah. In eternity, people's lives could be altogether what they were and had been, not just the worst things they ever did or the best things together. So she decided she would believe in it, or that she already believed in it. And then I'm skipping down to 260. All the tangles and knots of bitterness and desperation and fear had to be pitied. No better grace had to fall over them.
yes, it's the old nostrum that, you can take Lila out of the wild, but you can't take the wild out of Lila, because that's so deeply embedded in her subconscious, which is true of all of us. As an anthropologist, I guess it just, really resonates with me that so much of our values are cast at a very, very early age. And it's very, very difficult to shift gears in a fundamental way like she is trying to do.
I was thinking about that when, Constance, you were pointing out the only two things that Lila said, you know, when she was being bathed and cleaned and whatever at that woman's house, were about hell. And, you know, it made me go, well, what was the situation? We obviously knew the situation she was living in wasn't great, but like, how are those the words that she had? Like that tells us the language and
What she
she
heard.
was subjected to, right, as a child.
Mhm.
And so for that to be embedded in her in such a way that those are the only two things that come out, that then she has to, you know, and then also everything else she experiences along the way, that she has to sort of, I don't know if unlearn is the right word, and or even it describes what she does, but she's reconsidering so many things through her time in Gilead.
Yeah, and you know, we've always noticed the "it don't matter" as a refrain that comes
Mhm.
up in this novel. It seems to me, of course, that she learned that from Doll
Mhm.
as a way not to have expectations or not to be too disappointed. Um, and in a sense, she unlearns that, but in another sense, it's still true.
Mhm.
You can be hopeful, of course. She learns that, and maybe, and at the same time, maybe it all don't matter.
The it don't
Mhm.
matter comes up a lot during the snowstorm, and
Right.
every time she has, I was actually really confused by a lot of that section, because I'm like, is she in labor? Is she denying that she's in
I
labor?
think she was, yeah.
Happening here? It don't matter. It don't matter. Which, now that you say that, makes me think that she's trying not to, one, freak out that, you know, they're stuck
Not
in
to
a
freak
snowstorm,
him out. Didn't you
and not
say
freak him
that
out.
too?
Yes. Don't scare the Reverend. And also that it's like she's so close. She's so close to having what she wanted, which is this baby, but the possibility of things going wrong is still so real for her, and she knows that. So
Mhm.
it don't matter. It really is striking there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose that's a way of keeping something at arm's length,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Not getting too,
No.
yeah, not getting too attached to a particular hope or to a particular idea or possibility. Another refrain that I noticed in this section is, which is similar to "it don't matter," but not quite. That's how it is.
Yeah.
Comes up quite a bit. Ames is, this is on 256. This is part of Ames' melancholy. He said, "It's just arithmetic. That's what it comes down to. Bowden was married, has married 4 or 5 of his children, baptized a dozen grandchildren by now, and maybe I'll teach this fellow," speaking of meaning his son, "and maybe I'll teach this fellow to tie his shoelaces. The years of a man's life are 80 years and 10, give or take. That's how it is," he said. "I feel like Moses on the mountain, looking out on the life he will never have. Then I think of the life I do have. And that starts me thinking about the life I won't have. All that beautiful life." He shrugged. "I guess I'm pretty hard to please." Which I think is very similar to what Lila did, like thinking out on the life that she won't have, or the life that she might have, or the life that she does have. That's just how it is.
Mhm.
And I've been, one of the things I've been looking at the whole time we've been reading here is laughter and Ames's laughter. And so I didn't think about this until you said it tonight, Damon, about they're both of them and their melancholy. I think that's maybe part of why the laughter stands out, because it seems so counter to what I've never had the perception of Ames as a like super not that he's not amicable, but he's not happy-go-lucky cracking jokes. He's not that. And so, his laughter always sort of came with an undertone, I think. And I think, honestly, the melancholy is part of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and by the same token, I've never gotten the impression of him as bitter or
No.
or angry or
No.
yeah, just very, yeah, that's how it is.
Yeah, and I think he's a very shy person for being a pastor, and given his family, he's always seems to be always very, very tentative and in fears offending Lila, doing something that might drive a wedge between them.
Mm-hmm.
She repeatedly uses the word gentle and beautiful to describe him, and old.
Oh, I still think that's a hoot. I mean, at my age, that's a hoot.
That's when I think of Ames. Just now, I'm thinking of Henry Nouwen wrote a book called The Wounded Healer several years ago. But part of the idea was not necessarily to like. We talked about it a lot in pastoral care classes. Not necessarily to equate your pains or your grief or your scars with the scars of others, but to know your own pain, so that you can more easily relate to the pain of others. And I think that Ames does that a lot. Like his experience of losing his wife and his child and the hours of solitary reflection that he spends on it when he's not talking to Bowden. I think that enables him in some to empathize more readily or more easily with folks. Even in Home, he really wants to empathize with Jack. He just can't quite figure out how. I think he can't really quite figure out what the offense is that Jack feels that he's experienced, and that holds him back a little bit. But yeah, I think knowing his own pain helps him to relate to the pain of Lila. And there's a section in there where she describes kind of what he looks like when he's preaching and how he is when he's preaching. And then he looks out over the congregation and he can't look at any of them without thinking about their mother that he buried, or their whatever.
Confession sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, whatever. Like he knows all their stories in a way that not everybody else in the congregation knows their stories. He knows all of their pains and longings as well, I think. But let's see if I can find it. The knife also shows up in this passage. Lila decides to keep the knife. She's gonna hide it. She's gonna put it away someplace, so that the baby doesn't pick it up, I suppose. But yeah, she decides that's the thing that she's gonna. I guess it's just been on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine her getting rid of it. That would have been shocking.
She's not going to.
Yeah. But
I think the knife is her link to the past too, and one of the few constants in her life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at one point she kind of imagines it's the only thing that she would have to pass on to her child.
Yes.
And she wonders what her child will think of her when she says that to him.
I had to chuckle. This is just an aside, but when she's thinking back about her experience in St. Louis and at Christmas, and they had to close the house, and the gentleman who could not visit the house began singing bawdy Christmas carols outside, which most of the fine folks in John Ames Church had probably never heard. It's that she's in some ways much more worldly, than are the John Ames parishioners, or maybe John Ames himself.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Gilead is so small. I mean, it's
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't get the sense that he's ever lived anywhere else. He would have gone away to seminary for a little bit of time.
Yeah, I think
Maybe.
that's pretty clear in some of the earlier books. And
Yeah.
well, it's interesting that she would land there and then stay there because, like in the big city, like in St. Louis, not that things were good for her there, but, she can be anonymous. She doesn't have to be connected to other people since she doesn't seem comfortable with other people. And in Gilead, like in any small town, especially as a pastor's wife, I mean, she's on display. Everybody's in everybody's business. And that has to be, I mean, that could be uncomfortable for anyone, but I would think for Lila, especially, that's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing for many, many people in small towns, particularly men, to leave, and go to seminary or go into the military and then come back is probably a fairly typical loop. That, there's that brief experience, outside. And I think about this every time as a Marine myself, when I see guys wearing, Marine Corps, Army, ball caps, and I'm thinking maybe that was just maybe that was the most important event in their lives. And but I'm back home now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the question, leaving or staying, I think is a big question for everybody. I think also folks who grew up in New York City, but have there's plenty of folks that grew up in New York City and have never left New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Never experienced anything outside of there. We're about at the time where we might want to wrap up, and towards the end of this novel, Lila, I think she's reflecting on, thinking, considering the future. Ames is considering the future, which not just for himself, but for Lila and for the child. as he does, I think, all throughout Gilead as well. So I think maybe an interesting question. We'll find out whether it's interesting or not. Knowing what we know about Lila now, knowing that Ames will die at some at some point, and it'll be Lila and the child. We also get us like a side reference to like cats getting wet or something in this section that I just thought of, and made me think of Ames and Bowden baptizing cats in the river. So I guess knowing what we know or think we know about Lila, when Ames dies, do you think that she stays in Gilead, or do you think that she and young Robert, do you think that they leave town?
Again, back to John le Carré, the spy who came from the cold. It's very difficult once you've been in the warm to go back into the cold. I mean, just my guess. Will not want to leave that comfortable place that she never knew existed before.
She thinks she will leave at this point.
I know.
Still thinks it, but she's also getting more comfortable. I mean, she trusts at least Ames and the baby.
And some of the women, that some of the church women are very, very supportive.
Right.
Without asking, questions that, she might find hurtful.
Mhm.
Yeah. Jenny, what do you think? Think she stays or goes? Denny seems to think she stays.
Well,
Constance maybe thinks that she goes.
Well,
we
I'm kind of
know
not.
she.
Okay.
What, Constance?
Oh, I just said I'm not sure what happens, but at this point, she thinks she will.
Yeah.
Well,
We've seen her maturing, so.
yeah. I mean, we know Gilead, Robbie is 7, 8, right? Something.
Something like that, and Ames is still alive.
And Ames is still alive. So there's that much more time to ground her and link her. She's already to the point where she feels comfortable enough, or, well, I don't know. I don't know if she was comfortable with the post-birth bath, but it happened and she stayed. So, that's a bonding experience. But I will be very honest and say that the last line of this book, I didn't know what to think of it. It says someday she would tell him what she knew. And I finished it and I went, what does that mean? What does that mean? So I don't know. Maybe I was supposed to get that from the rest of the reading, what she knew, but I felt like that was a very open-ended statement, considering that that's the end of Lila's book. So I don't know that I know what I think about what she might or might not do.
And isn't that marvelous? I mean,
Well, that's true. Yes.
it leaves us speculating and thinking and
Chief, what do you think? Do you think she stays or goes?
This is really weird. I think she stays and Jack comes home.
Could see that.
Because Jack really he tried to make friends with the boy, played catch and all that sort of thing. And I think there's more of a relationship between Jack and Lila here than we will find out about. So that last sentence in the book.
Well, and there's already that understanding that she has with him, even without ever having laid eyes on him or talked to him. And I do remember them being friendly in Gilead.
Home.
Yeah.
Oh, is it Gilead or home?
Both, probably.
Oh, yeah.
Both.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying trying to remember. Home ends with Jack's son
And
is like
mother.
8, and his mother come looking for him, and he's not at the house. He's somewhere else.
He's
Yeah.
left town.
He's left. Okay, yeah, yeah. He's
He
left
had gotten
town.
a letter saying that Della
Mhm.
had moved on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And then she seems to be reconsidering here, but it's like the message under the carpet that, got delivered, but nobody got it.
yeah, yeah.
So at some point, I know Lois had asked, so at some point we are going to read Jack and discuss, right? We're just going to finish out this.
I guess I don't know. We certainly can.
Oh, you have to now.
Okay, well, there you go.
Well, Jack's pretty short, and we're into it this far.
Okay, there you go. Good. Done and done. The results
you go.
seal the deal.
Sounds good.
The group has spoken. I just want to read that last paragraph. For now, there were geraniums in the windows and an old man at the kitchen table telling his baby some rhyme he'd known forever, probably still wondering if he had managed to bring her along into that next life, if he could ever be certain of it, almost letting himself imagine grieving for her in heaven, because not to grieve for her would mean he was dead after all. Someday she would tell him what she knew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
There you go. So, thank you to everyone for joining in conversation. She'll never hear it, most likely. Thanks again to Marilynne Robinson for writing these.
I'm sure she listens every time we have these.
I have thought maybe I should just send her an email, say, hey,
Oh, you should, and just give her the,
we've been talking about these. Why don't you come out and pay us a visit sometime? We're just west of Gilead, we think. So if I ever bump into her on the streets of Iowa City, you just kind of said, Constance, that she taught at the University of Iowa for a number of years, maybe still does.
I think she does still teach at the writer's workshop at
Okay. Sure.
University of Iowa.
Well, if we ever get the chance, we'll offer her our thanks
Right.
in person as well. So, but yeah, thanks to you all for chatting.
organizing this.
Yeah, for anybody who's been listening or watching along or reading along, thanks for joining in some interesting conversations about salvation and existence and prayer and trust and regret and guilt and joy and laughter and
Discovery
What,
yes.
Tim?
and discovery.
Sure. Yes, and discovery and all the little fragments, I suppose, of our experiences. So yeah, thanks again to everyone, and yeah, I guess we'll see you for Jack in the spring sometime.
Good.
So
Okay.
all right, toodaloo.